So big thank you to Tierney Brothers before we get started. They've been awesome in helping on the esports side of things. We partnered with them about a year ago on the esports and VR front to kind of help spread some news and technology and help schools get up and running. And they've been an awesome partner in kind of building out our esports platform. So we just want to say a big thank you. They also did a lot of the marketing and registration for the webinar this morning. So just a big shout out to Tierney Brothers before we get started. A little bit about myself. My name is Josh Knutson. I'm the Esports and VR Solutions Director here at ByteSpeed. So it's a big fancy title to say that I'm essentially a product specialist here, focusing on the esports gear mostly. I'm a NACAD advisory board member, and NACAD stands for the National Association of Esports Coaches and Directors. This is like the National Coaches Association for esports at all levels. So high school, college, we're starting to get a little more professionals joining the group. We launched NACAD about a year and a half ago with the intent of really sharing information and resources on esports to help the community keep growing. And part of that mission is doing PD and webinars like this. So a little bit of info there. I'm also a former head coach and program director of my own team. I started the collegiate program at the University of Jamestown here in North Dakota way back in 2016, which, you know, back then there was 20 varsity level college programs and the high school scene was just getting ramped up too. So a lot has changed in the last 4 years, but that's kind of where I draw a lot of my background info from, actually going and doing this myself. And now, you know, working for ByteSpeed and kind of helping others learn from what I learned while we built out the UJ program. My contact info is here on the screen. Feel free to grab that. If you have questions or just want to connect, you know, follow me on social media, send me an email, shoot me a text, whatever works for you. I love talking about esports, and if you have questions that we don't get to today, please feel free to reach out and we'd love to get them answered. So, you know, just as a little sneak peek, little appetizer for the rest of the webinar, you know, knock on wood that we don't have any more technical difficulties. But, you know, when you're building out an esports space, I think a lot of people have this vision of what a facility will look like. And for us at Jamestown, this was it. This was kind of like our light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, as far as what we wanted to accomplish. And we'll talk about kind of the steps that we went through and the questions that we asked ourselves in moving from an empty room to kind of the cool space that you see here on the screen. So there's 4 questions that I want to talk about today in kind of the process of getting started and actually ramping up to having your facility up and running. And the first one is why. You know, what purpose do you have for building out esports in the first place? This is super important. It's the foundation of why you even build out a program. Why are we even building out a space? There has to be a thought and a strategic goal behind doing esports in the first place. So kind of like your do's, don'ts, and DIYs, you know, you want to have purpose to why you're building out the space. And we'll talk about some of the common ones here in a second. Don't rush into building it without a goal in mind. You know, we'll talk about some of the pitfalls that some schools, you know, that rush into esports. They don't have the adoption, they don't have the engagement that they were hoping for. And a lot of the times it comes from not having their why figured out. And some of the things that you can do yourself right now is collaborate with other members of your school to come up with your mission statement, come up with your why. So, you know, some of the common ones of like, you know, why are we adding esports? Student engagement is oftentimes the biggest one. You know, we want to have a place for our students to participate and, you know, be involved with their peers, be involved with the school. Maybe it's an after school place that they can, you know, go to and have a safe place to play and grow socially and emotionally. So student engagement is definitely one of the largest ones at every level, high school and college. if you're talking about expanding opportunities to participate, adding a new sport is a really cool thing to be able to offer your students at your school. Not a lot of programs come into it kind of thinking, oh, this is a multi-gender sport that we can add that fulfills so many of those traditional sports check boxes of why we would add basketball, why would we add football, soccer, whatever it might be. Esports kind of also fills those highlights of what a traditional athletic team can offer. So it'll help with your retention. This is a big thing for colleges, but also high schools. If you guys deal with open enrollment at all, recruitment and retention of students is something that's going to be something that you're at least thinking about. At the higher ed level, this is, I think, one of the main driving factors of building out a program. They want their students to stay at their school. They want to offer something attractive that another school might not have. So they're going to focus in on, how many students can we recruit? What's the draw here? Does this keep a student at school? There's a ton of benefits to building out an esports team. We're seeing GPAs come up across the country at the high school level. Truancy is going down, attendance is getting better. There's a lot of academic benefits to building out a team, and kind of that falls into that recruitment and retention kind of area as well. Like I said, the social and emotional growth, we want to offer a team so that these students who might not have ever participated in organized sports before can learn those team building skills. They can learn leadership. They can learn communication, critical thinking, interaction, working through conflict, all of these great, soft skills that we can learn by being a part of sports also apply to esports. And the list goes on and on, but these are some of the more concrete, more common of the goals of why you would add an esports program. And like I said before, programs that don't have this clear goal in the beginning, whether it's, we want more student engagement, or we want to win games, or, whatever it might be, the programs without that goal often struggle to get as many students to kind of bite on the hook and say, yes, I'm going to be a part of this. They're going to have lower numbers than expected. They're going to have, maybe programs that start up in the fall, and then all of a sudden in the spring, nobody shows up. So, having a clear goal and a vision and something to work towards, your why, is super important, even when you're talking about building a facility. So that brings us to question number 2, where? This is pretty a big one when it comes to, where are we going to put a physical space? A couple of the do's: you definitely want to collaborate with your IT early. If you already work in IT, awesome, that's great. You already have a foot in the door, but they're a group that is going to be involved with the esports program in one way, shape, or another, whether it's, helping with firewall, or, getting internet connections over to a new space in the school, or whatever it might be. They're going to be, and it could even be like maintenance of the computers. But they're going to want to be involved, and if you can bring them into the conversation early, that's going to help immensely when you're deciding where to put this, because they might have ideas that you're not thinking of right away, or might have some sticking points to where you think a space is great, but they're like, hey, let's think about a different space. Don't overlook non-conventional existing spaces. Not everybody can build a building for esports. I wish we all could. But the reality is, a lot of the times we're taking over existing library space or classroom space, or we're updating a computer lab or something like that. And that's okay. You can do some amazing things with space that you already have. And something that you could do right away is sketch out kind of a rough rendering of what a classroom would look like if you changed it to be an esports facility, or if you, had a multi-purpose room that you were going to have be classroom space for curriculum and all those great things, and esports. So, to dive in, what are the needs of a space? How do we even find a space that's suitable for building out our program? Square footage and capacity are going to be a big limiting factor. When you're building out your space and you're thinking of, how many stations can we fit in here? How many people can we fit in here? What's the fire code? Things that I would never think of, but, are definitely important when you're building out a facility like this. Accessibility is another big one. Do you have wheelchair access? Handicap accessible is one of the great things about esports, is that we're not limited by physical disabilities as much as we are in traditional sports. There are a ton of players out there who, are in a wheelchair or have adaptive controllers because, they have other hardships that they have to overcome. But esports is an activity where they can overcome those disabilities. So making sure that your facility is open to them and you can, have the accessibility you need is a huge thing to consider. Power and internet, if you guys are in IT already, I'm preaching to the choir on this, but you want to make sure that, depending on the number of PCs you have enough power and internet ports to be able to run everything, not blow a fuse. A couple of things here on those 2 points. One, a lot of the machines nowadays are super power efficient anyway, so you shouldn't have to worry too much there. And the internet conversation is interesting. When I built my program at University of Jamestown, we didn't have a super, huge bandwidth. We had 100 gig or 100 meg connection, excuse me, to our room. We were lucky enough to take an existing space on campus. It was the basement of our library, an old student media center that hadn't been used in a few years just because of changes in curriculum on the communications department side. So it was essentially a big open room, but it had its own internet connection, which was great. We didn't have to worry about, creating a new VLAN for our machines or doing anything that way. It was separate from the rest of campus, which was awesome. But it was only a 100 meg connection. And we had 15 machines in our first year, and we expanded to 24 in year 2. So we had 24 esports machines on 100 meg connection. We were competing, practicing, and, operating with no problem with that internet connection. One of the things that we did struggle with, however, with that type of a bandwidth is that, when we did updates and had to manage kind of the maintenance of our machines on the software side, it was something that we had to work around and a barrier that we had to overcome. We eventually kind of solved that problem by having work study students come in off hours. So a couple hours before practice, they would come in on the days when the software would patch. So, for League of Legends, they patch the game every 2 weeks. They'd come in, we'd make sure that the download was updated before practice started. It would take a couple hours to get everything through, just because sometimes you're dealing with an update that's, 500 meg. Sometimes you're dealing with an update that's like 8 gigs. Just kind of depends on the game, and it depends on what patch rolls through. And for those of you who are kind of getting lost in the technical jargon, think of like a sport like basketball. The rules haven't changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years, right? But for esports, they're constantly maintaining and balancing the game and changing the rules so that it's as fair and even balanced as possible. But that means the rules are sometimes changing every 2 weeks. So to be able to keep up with those changes, you have to download the patch and be able to update your game to the current iteration. So we had to manage our updates really smart because we didn't have a super great internet connection. Now in year 3, we had some extra budget money left over, and we did decide to upgrade to a gig for that room, which was amazing. But for the first 2 years, we got by with what we had. And, if you're worried about internet, you don't have to freak out about, oh my God, we have to spend so much money on upgrading our bandwidth. You can get by with what you have probably, because the other thing that you have to remember is that even though you might have a smaller connection speed or whatever you might have in your school, at the end of the day, when practice starts at like 3:30, the school's going to be empty, or you're going to have a lot less devices connected to that internet at the same time that you would during the day when classes are going and everybody has their phones and other devices like laptops, Chromebooks, whatever it might be, connected to that internet. At the end of the day, those devices are going to be off your network, and you're going to be able to have just your esports computers up and running. So it's kind of harped on the internet a little bit, but it is an important part of your space, and it's something that you should at least look into and consider a little bit. HVAC, make sure you have good heating and cooling. North Dakota gets really, really warm in the summertime. It was 101 here yesterday. And in the wintertime, it gets down to like the negative 20s is not uncommon. So making sure that your space, your room, your building, whatever it might be, has adequate heating and cooling is really important. A lot of the heat sinks on computers nowadays will keep things really, really cool throughout the day, to where you could be playing on it for 8 hours, no problem. But it's something that once you get a bunch of bodies in there and things start heating up really, really quickly. Lighting, I used to think that the dark room with the LEDs going and the computer screens lit up was really cool, and that's like what esports was supposed to look like, right? Anytime you see a stock photo of an esports facility, it's always dark and there's all these flashy colored lights going all over the place. And I used to think that was really cool, but nowadays I kind of am more in favor of kind of the image you see on the screen here. This is Tiffin University in Ohio. They have a standalone building. It's almost like a machine shed that they have outfitted for their esports program. It's got high ceilings, a couple of windows, and fluorescent light that I'm not a huge fan of, but it's bright. It feels like you're walking into a space where you can get work done. There's constantly this misconception that esports is just gaming, that we're just sitting in the dark, eating junk food and playing video games. But, you're actually a part of a competitive team. You're doing things that are integral to the growth of your students. So you want to have a space that kind of reflects that, mission of your program. And so I've become kind of in the last couple of years a lot more of a fan of kind of this open concept with good natural lighting and high ceilings and a brighter space. Okay, so question number 3, what do we need to actually even buy? We've talked about, where we need to put it, kind of the room that we want, but now what equipment do we actually need to get this thing up and running? Definitely visit or consult with other area schools that have programs up and running. Steal ideas, look at what they did and how they did it, and take away ideas for your own facility, and kind of share in that information. Don't overspend on gear. And we'll talk a lot about needs versus wants in this next section, but it is an investment that you have to make. And there is a financial commitment that you're going to have to move forward with. But there are ways to build out a really amazing esports facility without spending a super big, huge amount of money. And finally, DIY, get creative with the decor and aesthetic of the space. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Okay, needs versus wants. Budget is always a concern, especially at the K-12 level, even at the higher ed level. It's always something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. We talked about how much space is actually available, but something that you want to think about too is, what can we reuse? As we move forward throughout the next couple of slides, kind of think of, okay, do we have existing furniture that we can repurpose? Do we have, other things around the school that we're not using for decorations or stuff that we could put to make the environment look cool? And kind of always think, a Ferrari is really cool, but will a Camry do? And we'll talk about that, especially when it comes to PCs. And then finally, what are the priorities for your equipment? And infrastructure and PCs are kind of intertwined at the top. Peripherals definitely would be your next spot, then furniture, and then lastly, kind of the decorations for the room. So moving forward, infrastructure. We talked a ton about internet already, but one thing I do want to remember to talk about now is, firewalls. A lot of the times your school is going to have the game launchers and things that you'll need to operate your program blocked by your firewall. And you're going to need to work with IT to either unrestrict that access or create a separate network that has a little less restrictions on what you can actually access on those computers if it's going to be connected to your general school's internet. There are a lot of different ways to do this. There's some schools that will just loosen restrictions from 3:30 to 5:30. There are some schools that have a completely different network structure that they'll have their computers hooked into. It's 24/7 access, but you need an administrator password or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways to work through this kind of an issue, but things like Steam, the League of Legends launcher, Discord, those are probably going to be blocked by your network, and you're going to need to work through how do we actually get access to those programs. A wired connection versus Wi-Fi, definitely, if you can get it, wired is always preferable. You can get away with Wi-Fi if it's, a last resort, but your experience overall and the stability of that internet connection is going to be absolutely better over a wired Ethernet connection. And then we already talked about kind of managing updates. So just kind of keeping in mind, are we going to do that during the day, after practice? Do we have enough internet connection to where I can just push through updates at the beginning of practice? You'll just want to kind of keep in mind when and how you want to do those things. Computers. Big question that we always get asked is how many do we need? And that is determined by a couple of different factors. One, what titles are you playing? What's the minimum required to be able to actually play the game? So for Overwatch, it's a 6-on-6 game, so we would need 6 computers. League of Legends and a lot of the other titles are 5-on-5. Rocket League is 3-on-3. So if you have a roster that wants to be able to compete in a certain game, you need to make sure that you have enough computers to be able to actually log on, create your team, and move forward. A lot of schools will have, let's take League of Legends for an example. If they have an A team, they want to be able to practice and scrimmage against other members of their team. So they would have, 5 computers to the left on the room and 5 computers to the right on the room. And they'd be able to have like an A and a B squad play against each other in practice to be able to get better and do scrimmages and things like that. So a lot of times you'll see these numbers, you'll want to double it to be able to have like a varsity and a JV or a second string be able to play against them. I would say like the majority of K-12 schools will buy between 10 and 20 machines in their first year, kind of skewing more towards the 10 to 15 area. But, it's all budget dependent and kind of what their visions for the program and what commitments that they're making. There are also high schools that go ahead and buy 30 plus machines and just go for it. There's not a right or a wrong answer to how many, as long as it's kind of fitting your situation and you have the minimum number for, your roster to actually be able to compete. The specs, I'll bring up a couple of different SKUs here in a second. But the thing to remember is that a lot of esports titles are pretty well optimized. And you'll just want to check out like what the bare minimum to run the game is. A lot of times you're going to want to focus more on performance rather than graphics. It's really cool to have a 4K or an 8K display running and have the game look gorgeous. But in the world of esports, I care more about frames per second and, making sure that we're not overheating the machine or, we're getting everything out of it that we want from a competitive standpoint and from a performance standpoint. And then finally, just, think about future proofing. Any high quality machine that you buy right now is going to last you 3, 4, 5 years, no problem. You might have to, in a couple of years, take a look at upgrading a graphics card or adding another stick of RAM or something like that. But, when you look at some of the traditional esports titles, League of Legends has been around for 10 years. Counter-Strike has been around for 20 years. They're still relatively the same. They look better, yes, but the performance metrics and how much it actually takes a toll on your PC has not changed a ton over that time period. And that's with a lot of esports titles. They're optimized to run well on lower end specs as much as possible. So, what are some example builds when we talk about like what do we actually want in our PC? What do the guts look like? Here at ByteSpeed, we've kind of benchmarked a lot of different SKUs, a lot of different combinations to kind of come up with the best bang for your buck scenario. So a lot of times we'll kind of go in with the i5 as like our gold standard entry-level machine. You want 16 gigs of RAM probably across the board, no matter what your processor looks like, no matter what your GPU looks like. Storage, you don't need a ton as long as you're kind of just more focusing on esports titles. They're not super huge games, so like 500 gig SSD should be adequate. You'd definitely want an SSD rather than a hard drive. Just because your boot speeds and things you're gonna want the performance of an SSD over a hard drive. Graphics cards, your 1660 Super is kind of like the really great entry-level card. It's relatively inexpensive for the output that you get, and it's an amazing kind of building block to start with at a really good price point. If you want to kind of go for that upgrade, you're going to look for 2060, 2070 Super. A 2080 Super is like overkill. So when it comes to heat sinks, a standard fan setup is more than fine. Liquid cooling, in my opinion, is just for looks and just to say that you have liquid cooling. There's not a lot of esports machines that are getting overclocked these days. So you will be more than fine with just your standard fan setup. And same thing goes for a power supply. A 650 watt is going to be more than enough for most of the esports builds out there. And you don't need to go overkill in that department. And that's a great thing because then you can save money and put it towards other things like a graphics card or a processor. The entry-level build on the left, it's going to run most esports titles great. The mid-tier machine that we have on the right side with a couple of different upgrades, you're going to be able to run the other titles that are a little more taxing at higher graphics settings. You're not going to have to worry so much about turning down the in-game settings or having things, maybe not perform at like ultra on every setting. Peripherals. This is kind of like the easiest way to go from a like good existing machine to looking and feeling like an esports setup. Displays, monitors are super important. The 24-inch 144 hertz is kind of the gold standard. You don't need a curved monitor. You don't need something that's like 40 inches wide. Just like a normal size monitor with a good refresh rate is like what you're going to want to prioritize. For keyboards and mice, mechanical keyboards were created for esports. They're more responsive. You can customize the pressure sensitivity of the keys to be able to give you better feedback. So like for some games like, StarCraft, where you have to do 200 some inputs a minute, you're going to want to have, really sensitive keys. Same thing with like your MOBAs, like League of Legends or something like that. You're going to want, less sensitive keys to where if I just barely press it, it's going to trigger the switch. It's actually going to register as a button press. For FPS games where you want a little bit more, decisive keystrokes, you're going to go with a kind of a stickier switch or something like that. And at the end of the day, a mechanical keyboard and mouse, they're just going to last longer than your standard membrane keyboard and mouse. And they don't have to be super overly expensive. The two that we have on the screen here, the mouse and the keyboard, are in like the $50, $60, $70 range. So they don't have to be like super duper expensive. And headsets, you want something that has over the ear noise canceling, has a good microphone. And that's, how you're going to communicate and still hear the game sounds. For first person shooter games, hearing game audio is super important. There's audio triggers in every game. So you want to be able to hear not only the game audio, but also your teammates in a communication software like Discord, and be able to actually, talk to each other, communicate, and have the audio performance that you need. So that's kind of it for peripherals. The next one on the list is furniture. This is a great place to save money. What do you already have? What can we reuse? Whether it's chairs or desks. At the end of the day, you just want something that's comfortable, adjustable, and it's going to last you, a good amount of time. So for chairs, there's things like Respawn that are out there. They're great, amazing chairs. I have one at my desk at home. I game on. I have one here at the office. They're great chairs, and any racing style chair is going to give you those 3 check marks. But also just a good office chair is more than likely going to give you that too. And it's, like I said, a good place to save a couple $100s if you have existing things that are going to work. Especially on the desk side too. As long as it's sturdy and you have enough usable surface area, you're going to be more than fine, using an existing table or countertop or whatever it might be. When we built out my facility at Jamestown, we had some existing granite countertops that were awesome. And, yes, we could have spent a bunch of money to buy new desks and have everything look the same, but we had this awesome counter space available. Why not use it, right? It would have also been really, really heavy and cumbersome to get rid of. But, we reused what we already had, and we were able to save some budget and put it towards something else. And, there's other furniture. If you have a film area, or, you want a coach's desk, something a little different. If you're creating a casting booth, or something in production, you might need different style of desk or chair, depending on kind of what you're looking for. And finally, as far as what do we want to buy, what do we want to put in, aesthetics, decor, don't be afraid of getting creative here. Big things, lighting, you want it bright, you want it to be natural light if possible. Windows are amazing. If you can get a film to kind of tint it so it's not so harsh, that's great. But there's other creative ways to do your lighting. Branding, if you have fat heads or pennants or things that have your school branding on them, those are great. Stuff that's just going to fill the room out, and it's not going to be, okay, we walked into the door and it's a bunch of white walls and computers and blue light. So you can get creative, you can involve other areas in the school. Your art students could create artwork for the space. You could, have a number of different things to be able to liven up the space. And it kind of all ties everything in together. It's something that I think a lot of people forget about, just because it's not directly tied to playing esports or, being in that competitive environment. But it is important to kind of the look and the feel and the space overall. And again, just do as much as you can, because the DIY on kind of your decorations is going to be, not only is it going to mean more to your students if they did it themselves, but it's also going to save you a lot of money. So, okay, question 4, real briefly here. We have about 10 minutes left before I have to jump off, and I do want to leave some time for questions. But how? How do we actually afford this? How can we build out our space? How can we afford to buy all of this stuff? Number 1, be an informed consumer. Talk to your vendors, engage with your tyranny rep, get ByteSpeed involved in the conversation. Let's talk about what your needs are, what your wants are, and kind of make sure that you're getting the best products for your situation. Don't let the upfront costs scare you. This is going to take some financial commitment, but the great thing about esports is that while in year 1, when we have to buy all this stuff, it might seem really expensive, your operating budget from year to year is going to be extremely low. There's not a lot of travel in esports. You could run a 40-game season and never leave your home school. You know, you're not paying for bus drivers, you're not paying for insurance for busing, you're not paying for meals or hotels for overnight stays because you can play from your own school. So there's a lot of great cost saving that happens, and you don't need to buy machines every year. Like I said, the computers that you buy nowadays, especially for esports, are going to last you like 3, 4, 5 years, no problem. So, you know, I might spend 30 grand on machines in year one, but all of a sudden, you know, I don't have to worry about buying new computers for like 4 years. So that recurring cost doesn't happen, and you have the opportunity to save a lot of money in the subsequent years after you start. And you know, do it yourself. You can fundraise. A couple of kind of ideas for budgeting. You know, money comes from a lot of different areas, whether it be student life, athletic department, the Department of Underwater Basket Weaving. You know, it doesn't matter where the money's coming from as long as you get the support from your admin that you're looking for. That doesn't always happen. Annual budgets aren't always available. So some of the tips that we have, grant writing is a huge way to get funding for esports. If you go to ByteSpeed.com, under our resources tab, we have a funding page that has a list of like 70 different education grants for STEM equipment, VR equipment, other things like that that you can do and get a dual purpose machine. So a computer that'll run high-end curriculum during the day, all of a sudden has the hardware that we can run esports in the afternoon. Fundraising, you know, there's groups out there like the Varsity Esports Foundation that give grants and money to teams that are starting up. There's things like eTeam Sponsor where you can do kind of like that social media fundraising, even something as small as like bake sales. One of my favorite examples of fundraising, we work with a school in Illinois that actually built an arcade cabinet in their computer class, and they're raffling off tickets to be able to win this arcade cabinet that has like a Raspberry Pi in it. They spent minimal investment in getting this thing together. It was a class project, and now they're going to sell raffle tickets to do a big esports team fundraiser. So you can get really creative. There's a lot of great ideas. We have a funding kit on our website that you can look through to kind of get an idea of where to start. And finally, kind of on the sponsorship and partnership side of things, you know, don't be afraid to go to your local businesses, people on your booster club. Talk to them about, you know, what their ideas are for engaging students and giving opportunities. Chances are, you know, they're not going to be able to fund your whole program, but they might be able to give you bits and pieces that'll add up real quickly. So just a couple of photos here, and then I know we had a question come through and I want to save a little bit of time here. This is the University of Jamestown. This is our facility with the lights on. We nicknamed it the Lair because it was in the basement of the library and you had to walk down this creepy tunnel to get there. But it was this beautiful lab that we built out. We had awesome granite countertops kind of in the middle and on that back wall. And then we had desks that ring the outside. This is when we had 24 machines in it. They're now expanding kind of behind this back wall and adding in 10 more machines. It's a great facility and kind of where I cut my teeth in building out an actual room. You know, on the high school side of things, they can look very different. They can also look very similar to what a collegiate program would look like. Elkhart High School in Indiana, they literally just are repurposing a classroom space. They've got kind of tiered seating and they're able to get, you know, their esports computers. They sit on the floor kind of in front of the desks, and they have this great room to be able to meet and practice and play in, but it's just a classroom with nice high-end equipment. You know, Akron STEM in Ohio, they renovated part of their library into a dedicated esports space. They took an open floor concept. Everything's on caster wheels. You know, you see the display, the IFP here that's on wheels to be able to watch game tape. They've got the machines on a countertop that's kind of connected to the wall, chairs and stuff. While it is only an esports space, it looks very similar to, you know, the other esports programs that are out there. And finally, you know, I just want to show you the 100 Teams CashApp Compound. This is a professional esports organization. They're a professional team. They compete in the professional leagues that are out there. They spent millions of dollars building this amazing, beautiful building. But if you take a look at this room, And then you take a look back at the Akron STEM High School, you're seeing computers attached to the outside wall with space for meeting and hanging out and kind of seating that can be flexible. It's the same thing here. They have a countertop with computers ringing the outside, chairs. They've got a big couch in the middle, but it's an open room with computers in it. It just can kind of show you that you can have an amazing facility and you don't have to spend a ludicrous amount of money building out, this giant building. So that's just some of the things to think about. What I'll do here is, I know there's a question in. I'm going to reach back to my contact info. Just throw that on the screen here if you haven't grabbed that already, and I'm going to open up the Q&A. Larry asked, are gaming laptops a good investment? And what I will say here, Larry, and everybody else kind of wondering about mobile, they are an option. If you're in a point where you don't have facility space, you don't have physical space that you can dedicate completely to an esports program, you can absolutely look into a high-end laptop to be able to have kind of a plug and play or a stow and go kind of option. I will say that gaming laptops typically are more expensive than a desktop, and the performance, there will be a little bit of a difference. Just because we can get full-size parts in a desktop chassis, and that doesn't always happen with a laptop. But there are some great options out there, and it is, like I said, an option if you have, okay, hey, we can set up in the library for 2 hours a night, but we have to tear it down, and because somebody else has to use that space. So they are an option. I would just say make sure you talk with your vendor about what specs are available. And kind of make sure that the performance is going to line up as close to possible as the desktop that you would get. So yeah, no problem. Happy to answer that question. Anybody else have stuff that they have questions about that we didn't get to today? I know it's a ton of info to throw at you in a very short amount of time. But I hope we covered a lot of the different key areas that you're going to look into when you're actually building out your space. We have about 2 minutes left before I have to shut her down. So if you have questions or have any comments, feel free to throw those in the Q&A or the chat. And one thing too, while you guys are typing out your questions, if you have any, just another big shout out to Tierney Brothers for helping us host the event. Like I said, they've been an amazing partner, and moving forward with esports, they're going to be a great resource. If you have questions about your individual situations, talk to your Tierney reps, talk to us here at ByteSpeed. We'd love to help you out. We'd love to get you involved and get your teams off the ground. There's a lot of great info out there. We just talked about facility building today. There's a ton more. I could talk for hours on esports. It's a great opportunity for your students